therefore, what does fiqh actually deal with? So you've got these narrations, right? As we see, what does fiqh really deal with? So fiqh actually, when it comes to these evidences, like I showed you the hadith, the chains. So there's two things in the chain that the scholars used to focus on. One was the meaning of the source, right? And the other one was the transmission of the source. So the source is the statement of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the ayat to the Qur'an. Okay. So the question was, they would take a verse of the Qur'an, and then, like, for example, like, let's say they took the verse of the Qur'an, فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ, and pray to your Lord and give sacrifice. So they would ask this, look at what the scholar said, the Sahaba and others, and they say, does every one of the Sahaba agree on the meaning of this ayah? If the meaning was agreed upon, they would call that verse decisive. They would say, this is a decisive verse, meaning no two people disagree on the meaning of this particular verse, right? So it became, it was classified as decisive by the scholars. So they wrote it down as decisive. But you might get some verses in the Quran where scholars might differ, right? So there might be a verse in the Quran where scholars might say, okay, what do you think, what is the meaning of this verse? And then one scholar would say, okay, this verse actually is referring to such and such, and this verse. For example, like the issue in wudu with regards to wiping over the head when you're doing your wudu, right? So the Quran says, whenever you stand up for prayer, wash your faces, wash your arms up to your elbows, wipe your head. So when it says wipe your head, the scholar said, well, what does that mean? Does it mean wipe your entire head 100%? Or does it mean just touch your head? Or is there like some more explanation behind it? So this is an example of a verse which is speculative in meaning there's a difference at least between two people in the early years and the companions' years who would differ on the meaning of this. So therefore the source, the meaning of the source itself now can be differed. Like, is it something which is agreed upon, or is it something which there's room for difference of opinion? And number two is the transmission. So transmission is, how has the source reached us, right? So the Quran has reached us in a very decisive manner. Like, everyone agrees what the Quran is. There's no real difference in the Quran. Everyone agrees Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen is a verse in the Quran. Everyone agrees Qul Hu Allahu Ahad is a verse in the Quran. No one disagrees on that. But the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they can either be decisive, where everyone agrees he said this, right? So for example, like, did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam pray in Masjid Nabawi, like in the Masjid in Medina? Did he ever pray in there? So it's decisive. Everyone unanimously agrees he prayed in there, right? No one would disagree. No one would say, no, he never prayed in there. He did pray in there. But someone would say, did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam ever wipe over non-leather socks when he did wudu? Right, so he did wudu, and did he ever wipe over non-leather socks? We know he wiped over leather socks. There's like about 70 companions who have reported that he wiped over leather socks, or like they learned it from him. But with regards to wiping over non-leather socks, right, so non-leather material, there's difference of opinion, right? So this would fall in a speculative. So now, as you see, as the time goes on, right, the scholars are now going to have to codify this in maybe different ways, right, depending on how they see the text. So if I was to summarize this, I can summarize this in this list now. So the blue in the top is a text which is decisive in both transmission and meaning, right? So it's decisive. So for example, like in the Quran, Allah says, pork is haram, right? No Muslim differs on this issue. Everyone agrees pork is haram. Aqimus salat, establish prayer. No Muslim disagrees that prayer is necessary, because the transmission is decisive and the meaning itself is also very clear. However, the other three categories, decisive in transmission but not in meaning, or number three, decisive in meaning but not in transmission, and number four, indecisive in both transmission and meaning. So I'll give you an example. So for example, in the narrations, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, there's no prayer without Fatiha. There is no prayer without Fatiha. This is a narration, and if you analyze the chain of the narration, there's multiple narrations for this, and it's an authentic narration, right? However, it does not reach the level of transmission like the Quran. Yeah, so like the Quran has been passed down to us, the level of transmission of this narration hasn't reached the same level. So we treat it as being decisive in meaning. All scholars agree on the meaning of this hadith, but the transmission, they differ on the strength of the transmission. It's authentic, but it's just the level of transmission doesn't really reach the level of the Quran. So here is where you have a difference of scholars. So some scholars would say, okay, if you were to pray your salat and you didn't read Fatiha, would your salat be valid? So some of them would say, no, it wouldn't be valid because the Prophet Muhammad said there's no prayer without Fatiha. And others would say, no, we're not saying that he didn't say that. We're saying that the level of transmission isn't as same as the Quran. So maybe he was saying this statement to someone and there's more to it, like there's more context to it that we have to understand. And this is something in the science of hadith. If you study the science of hadith, you'll find this. I'll give you an example. For instance, like there's a well-known narration where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu he instructed for dogs to be killed, right? So does this mean now that as a Muslim, dogs are evil creatures, they should all be killed because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu said they should be killed? So the scholars say no, because the Prophet sallallahu he said this statement when there was a problem with these feral dogs in Medina, right? So there was feral dogs in Medina, and there was this culture that people had where people would actually spend more time and more money on their pet dogs than spending it on their families, and sometimes the families would suffer. So the Prophet ﷺ put a ban on dogs, and because there was a high number of dogs running around, he instructed the Sahaba to get rid of the feral dogs. And this was a situation. So when we look at when we say that it's not decisive, we're trying to say maybe there's more to it, and we got to research it, we got to look into it. So anyway, so evidences are ordered in this particular manner. So now, if I was to show this, I'm supposed to say types of, it says tiles of, don't know what that means, but there's ikhtilaf there in that word. So types of rulings. So you have obligatory, you have highly emphasized, you have recommended, you have permissible, and then you have impermissible haram. All right. So the ones I've done in blue represent that top category, which is the scholars usually only call fard an action which has been established at the highest level of transmission and at the highest level of meaning an issue which no one differs in. They only call something fard when they don't differ in that issue. If they differ in that issue, then you can't give it the highest status, right? So it cannot be called fard. And likewise, the opposite, the haram issue. So something can only be declared as being haram if it has been established at the highest level of, transmission and meaning as well. Like, for example, pork, everyone agrees pork is haram. But what about snake's meat? Is snake's meat haram or not? So it's not in the Quran explicitly. And the narrations about this, some scholars differ on this. So some scholars say snake's meat is okay, and other scholars say, no, snake's meat is haram as well, because it's a predatory animal, and therefore you can't eat it based on other evidences. So that's where you have room for difference of opinion. So if you got farad at the top, haram, right? These are categorical. And then you have those other issues which are less than this. So highly emphasized sunnah mu'akkada, which you probably come across. And then you got things which are recommended in Islam, and then permissible, which is just generally just permissible in Islam. So you got these kind of like different varying categories. So this actually shows us, what does this teach us? This teaches us that when the scholars are looking at evidences, they are forced into codifying or listing the evidences with regards to these 2 points, the strength of transmission and the decisiveness in its meaning. And this way you get these terms from, like when someone says to you, this is fard, and then, so you say, well, in the time of the companions, did they ever use these terms? You say, well, no, they didn't use these terms. But we have to look at the terms based upon evidences that reached us. Okay, so what kind of rulings do we sort of like find in fiqh? So in fiqh, we find the rulings that we find are things like worship, right? So you got your salat, your fasting, your charity, zakat, hajj. You got personal dealings, right? So you got like marriage, divorce, all those issues. You got transactions. You got criminal punishments, you got legal cases, and you got military issues, foreign policy, etc. Right? So all of these kind of things fiqh will cover. So if you were to buy yourself let's say, for example, a fiqh book in whichever school of thought you studied, then what would basically happen is that you would take those evidences. So you would read that book and you would find chapters covering all of this, right? Because ultimately, what the faqih, remember that diagram I showed you of the Sharia cloud? The faqih is trying to organize everything so that it becomes very easy for anyone. Like I'm sitting here, I'm sitting in front of you, and I've got my camera on, and I've got some nice little lights in the background. If any of you guys saw those, right? But none of you guys said anything, so anyway, I'll ignore that one. So you got these lights in the background. You got me sitting here. I got the camera. What's the ruling of sitting in front of a camera? What's the ruling of teaching long distance? What's the ruling? So you're not going to find these explicitly. You're not going to find these explicitly in the evidences, right? But the scholars will know the ruling for it, right? So the scholars will know that everything for a Muslim to be able to live their life is somehow rooted in some way or another in the early sources, right? So the scholar is going to try to come up with an answer to answer this. Okay, the revelation now. So now revelation is basically, when we discuss revelation is the Quran. When we ever talk about revelation, we use the term wahi, right? Wahi means a discrete form of communication, right? So in Arabic, you basically, if any form of communication where you can't see, like, you know, like olden days we used to have, I don't know in the olden days we used to have, but when we were kids, you used to have like a cup and you just put a string on there, and then you used to stand, like your friend used to stand like about, 10 meters away, and then you would say something to him in that cup, and then he would, oh yeah, I can hear you, and then it's like eureka. Everyone was like amazed at this. So if you don't have that string in between and you both can hear each other, and it seems strange how you can hear each other, you call this a wahi, right? So wahi is a secret form or a discrete form of communication. So this form of communication, i.e. the Qur'an, which was sent down to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it was sent over approximately 23 years. So you got 23 years period in which the Qur'an from beginning to end was revealed, and 13 years approximately in Makkah and 10 years in Medina. Now, I actually normally when I deliver this this course, it's like what I'm presenting today is really like a 6-7 hour course, right? Full 6 or 7 hours. But I've cut out a lot of it just to kind of get to the main sort of like issues for you guys. So 13 years in Makkah, 10 years in Medina. So if you really want to understand how fiqh is seen through the ayats of the Quran, you need to analyze the verses that were revealed in Makkah and the circumstances, and then the verses that were revealed in Medina, and you start to get a picture of how legislation was slowly being revealed to mankind. Yeah, and I'll touch upon this a bit later on with an example, inshallah. Okay, what are the main topics of the Quran? So 23 years, over 23 years, the Quran is revealed, right? 23 years. There are 4 main sort of like categories you can bunch the verses into. So you can take the verses and you can classify them under 4 categories. So number 1, you got belief at the top. So some verses are to do with belief, like for example, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Ayat al-Kursi. These are usually to do with beliefs. Then you got verses that are to do with foundations of the Sharia, Islamic law, which we're talking about, right? So you got like how to do your wudu, how to do your tayammum, how to, fast, etc. Number 3, you got noble character. So noble character is basically how a person is supposed to, behave in front of their families, in front of the outside community, with non-Muslims, etc. Right? So these are found in the Quran as well. And stories of the past prophets and nations. So you've got like stories of the people of Nuh alayhi salam, the stories of the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam, stories of Musa alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so you got all of this in the Quran. And all of this is very important for us, without a doubt. We need to know all of this in order to understand how we're supposed to live as Muslims. Okay, so if you want to look at the foundations of the Quranic legislation, right? So foundation of the Quranic legislation, meaning that you've got the Quran, but you want to learn more about how the Quran implemented the law, right? Or legal rulings. So there's 4 sort of like fundamental features, right? There's 4 fundamental features that you'll find in the Quranic legislation. So if someone asks you a question, for example, like, why didn't the Quran just tell us, like, from beginning to end how to pray our salat? Like, why don't we find a chapter, Surah Salat, and it starts off with, raise your hands and do this and do that? Why not? Well, one of the reasons is because to be brief, right? To keep everything brief. Just tell us the main sort of points, and then the rest will be explained by the Prophet ﷺ, right? And that's what the Quran says. Yeah, whatever the messenger gives you, you take it. So brevity, this is the first thing. This is one of the features of the Quran. Number 2 is removal of difficulties, right? So removal of difficulties basically means that the Quran will never, this is what the Quran teaches us. Allah will never implement a law which is too difficult for humans to act upon. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Right? So Allah, He comes to remove difficulties, right? Not to give you difficulties. So for example, like, if a person cannot perform Hajj, then Hajj is not obligatory on them. If a person is unable to fast, they simply make it up on a different day. Or if they can't even do that, they just give a monetary penalty, a compensation for it. And if a person is unable to give charity, they don't give charity. If a person can't pray standing, they pray sitting, right? So it's like the Sharia will never compel someone to do something which is beyond their means, beyond their ability. Right. Number 3, gradually. So the legislation was revealed gradually, right? Over the entire 23 years, bit by bit, the laws were revealed, right? And this was in order to acclimatize them to the laws, right? So you got a community who's being shifted from one sort of like mindset, belief in idols and all that, into a totally different one, which is monotheism. So it's going to take time for them to acclimatize. They're going to have certain sort of like embedded practices which are contrary to Islam, but Islam is not going to tell them to get rid of them all of a sudden. Some of these, the Quran's going to slowly wean them off it. Like, for example, the ruling of alcohol. So the ruling of alcohol was actually prohibited over several years, right? There were several years of laws that came down, rules, verses. And this is slowly what began to happen. So gradual. And the final one is reduction of religious duties. So reduction of religious duties basically means that the Sharia, like compared to the past nations, like the Muslims of this ummah have got it very easy, right? So what tends to happen, with religion over the years is, like, religion, if it's not kept in check, scholars in the past, in the Bani Israel, what they began to do was they began to impose on their people rulings and made life extremely difficult. Eventually, life became so difficult for the Bani Israel that people just sort of like rebelled against the rabbis of Bani Israel. Yeah, and this was one of the things that the Prophet ﷺ came to uplift. Yeah, so to remove all the shackles that they had imposed upon themselves. So Islam came to make things easy. Right? So reduction of religious duties.